speaking with Jeffrey Dill, who is an affiliate professor of sociology and liberal studies in the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University. Dr. Dill is also the Donkian Research Fellow for Character and Culture at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. Several years ago, the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at UVA launched a major research project in order to better understand moral formation of high school students. Researchers went into 10 different sectors of schools, from public schools, both urban and rural, to private schools, both religious and non-religious, to charter schools and others. Dr. Dill was one of those researchers, and he and his assistant focused on homeschooling, conducting 62 interviews with 35 families in 11 different states across the country. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Dill. I know that homeschooling is an increasingly popular choice for parents in our country. And so I thought maybe we could start by you just explaining kind of how prevalent it is right now, and then maybe what some of the different reasons are that people have for choosing this option.
Sure. Well, thank you, Joanna. Thanks for having me here. So the counting homeschoolers is actually a very difficult thing to do. Mm-hmm. So they're a hard to reach population just because we don't, in some states, homeschoolers have to actually register and say that they're homeschooling. Other states, they don't. So it varies quite a bit, and it's difficult to actually get a number. So consequently, researchers count homeschoolers differently. And so the number of homeschoolers in our country is as high as 2.3 million by one researcher who's an advocate for homeschoolers. Probably the best data we have on homeschooling, it comes from the National Center for Education Statistics, which is a federal government arm, and their number for homeschoolers is below 2 million, so it's about 1.7 million. So somewhere between 1.7 and 2-ish, I think, is probably a safe estimate for the numbers of homeschoolers. It's grown quite a bit in the last 2 decades. And we think it's still increasing. The latest government numbers showed a little bit of a plateau and not as much growth in the last data collecting cycle that they did. But we still think it's growing. The pace might slow, but just to give you a sense of how that looks in terms of the entire population of students in our country, somewhere between 3 and 4% of all kids in our country are homeschooled. So it's still a pretty small number. Almost 10% of students in our country are educated in private schools, and so it's a still small but growing number of students who are homeschooled. So that's numbers. Now, why people homeschool? One thing that I'm sure we'll talk about, the homeschooling population is quite varied and diverse, and so consequently, the reasons people homeschool are very different from each other. And so, in our own data, in those 35 families that we talked to, mm-hmm. we actually sort of listed almost 40 different reasons. Wow. For what drew people to homeschooling. And sometimes that could be very, very practical. Like maybe mom or dad has a job that just requires quite a bit of travel. And so maybe the family said, hey, let's homeschool so that we can sort of travel with mom or dad at the job and sort of do education that way. Sometimes a student might be involved in some sort of intense athletic training, like a tennis player or a soccer player whose team requires quite a bit of travel. And so schedule-wise, families might just decide homeschooling is easier than trying to fit into the regular school schedule. But the vast majority of the reasons why people homeschool have something to do with moral formation. Okay. So that could be they want stronger influence as parents on the kind of person their child becomes, and are worried about peer influences in the school. It could be because they're worried about various kinds of consumerist messages that their kids might get in schools. In a really interesting case, there's a small but growing population of African American homeschoolers. And some of the research with that population suggests that many of those folks actually homeschool because they're uncomfortable with the kinds of messages that their children might receive about what it means to be a Black person in America.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, their motive is really a motive about understanding racial identity and having parents more involved with what that means for their kids. So a whole host of reasons, but I would say homeschoolers are highly attuned to the question of moral formation and the role that education has in it.
Okay, that's interesting. And so along those lines, you talked in your chapter of the content of their character about two sort of common moral frameworks that emerged as you looked at the different reasons or the different kinds of homeschoolers out there. Could you kind of first define for us what you mean by a moral framework, and then describe what those two frameworks are that emerged and how maybe they influenced those families' approach to how they did homeschooling?
Yeah, so moral framework was the term that that I used, and I think several of us in this sort of research project used. It can, there's lots of different terms for this. You could think of a moral framework as a worldview or a moral culture or an ethical system. But basically, this is sort of how, when you think about what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, when you sort of try to understand how you think through decision making, what are the assumptions you make to make those kinds of decisions that lead to various actions, right? And that's what we kind of mean by a moral framework, right? Okay. So what is the underlying understanding of the world that makes me think this is a good thing to do and this is a bad thing to do? And those vary quite a bit. And researchers have come up with various names for different ways that people think through this moral framework. The two that seemed most prevalent in the homeschooling population really map onto two groups of homeschoolers that a lot of researchers on homeschoolers have found. And so the frameworks that I identified were a theistic moral framework and an expressivist moral framework. And so I'll just sketch kind of briefly what those are. So the theistic one is like it sounds. It's so when I think about what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, I look to the authority of some divine source to help me understand that. Mm-hmm. So this is right and this is wrong because God says so. The expressivist is more focused on less on a kind of religious authority and more on trying to figure out what my own self or my own what my own self or my own emotions might think is good or bad, right? So I may feel that this activity or this action makes me happy or fulfilled. Mm-hmm. So that's a good thing because I'm happy or fulfilled in doing it.
Yeah.
And this action does not make me happy or fulfilled, and so my moral decision making is sort of rooted on that particular framework as opposed to what God might say I should or shouldn't do. So and that maps on to the kind of larger categories that researchers have identified in homeschoolers, and that they're called different things, but religious homeschoolers are a big category of homeschoolers, right?
Yeah.
The biggest, actually. So the majority of homeschoolers homeschool for various kinds of religious reasons and would fall into that theistic moral framework. Mm-hmm. Other homeschoolers do it not so much for theistic reasons, and so in many cases those are more secular people. Mm-hmm. Some of the categories or names that researchers given these groups are religious and secular, or ideologues and pedagogues, they're sometimes called, or believers and inclusives. Okay. But so they're two different camps, and although the population is varied, most of the population falls into those two camps. Okay.
Makes sense. Did you see, well, we'll get to this maybe a bit later. So in terms of the cultivation of virtue, which is maybe part of moral formation, personal character, cultivation of character, what did that look like in the different homeschooling families that you interviewed, kind of across both of those two groups?
Yeah, so I think that I'll talk more about those two groups as I answer this question. So let me start with the sort of expressivist moral framework group. And those were largely people that were not homeschooling for religious reasons.
Okay.
Not always. In some cases, those might represent some religious people. But the most important thing for this group, in terms of why they're homeschooling, was to develop the student's sense of self. So, and the problem with schooling for this group is that the structures of school actually stifle the curiosity of the individual learner. So they force the individual, school forces the individual learner into certain kinds of boxes, right? So we learn to sit at our desk, and we learn to take tests, and we learn to, nod our head yes or raise our hand. And it's a highly kind of conformist model for these homeschoolers. And so the purpose of homeschooling is to actually free ourselves from that kind of box fitting that school does for us. And so what homeschool can allow these families to do is simply let the child grow in his or her natural environment.
Yeah.
And so if I'm a young child and I'm interested in dinosaurs, and then let's do a deep dive in dinosaurs. Maybe we'll visit the Natural History Museum and we'll read lots of books. And then if I, maybe a month later, I'm interested in the American Revolution, we can move that direction. But it's really guided by the interests of the student.
Okay.
And for these individuals, you're trying to cultivate in the child his or her own interests and a desire to learn that can be tapped by allowing the child to scratch the various kinds of curiosities that might emerge from the child. And so when it comes to the what we call private virtue in the book, you're trying to form in the child a sense of their own sense of what's right and what's wrong, and allow their learning and their interests to kind of blossom. And so what you're trying to avoid is peer influences, right? So in many of these expressivist families, their main concern, or a main concern, is the way in which school environment might force assumptions of youth culture. So maybe wearing the right kinds of clothes, or having the right kinds of things, material things, right? And so what they're trying to cultivate is an understanding, an individual understanding of the child's sense of identity, apart from what these families might identify as negative messages that the school might receive.
Yeah.
So the fact that a teenage girl isn't as worried about what she may wear or how she may look is, a kind of moral virtue in families like this. And the homeschooling environment actually enables them to cultivate that, apart from what they might perceive as negative influences from peer culture in a school. And now on the other side, the more theistic frameworks, their understanding of what it means to be a good person comes largely from their religious traditions, whatever they may be, right? And so what homeschooling allows those families to do is create an environment in which those virtues are celebrated. And so whether that's a kind of personal spiritual habit of prayer, or reading scriptures, or even studying scriptures, those things can all happen in the homeschooling environment in ways that they might not in a traditional school.
Sure.
And the parents can continually reinforce the value or importance of those kinds of practices. And so habits that get developed can produce virtues that are important for those traditions.
Okay, makes sense. Great. So thank you. And in terms of public virtue, so those are kind of personal, inward virtues. I thought you defined public virtue well. So I'm just going to read this definition from your chapter. You called public virtue the attributes, qualities, and habits of individuals directed to the common welfare and benefit of the larger community, even at the expense of their individual interests. I thought that was really sort of striking, especially in the context of homeschoolers. Is this something that you observed homeschoolers caring about, kind of the larger community? And if so, what did the cultivation of public virtue look like?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really important question because to be a homeschooler, you're actually withdrawing from a larger schooling setting, whether that's a public school or even a private school, and you're withdrawing into your home, right? So in theory, it is actually a kind of removal from a larger understanding of the public. I think there's several things to say here. Number one, the homeschooling community is highly diverse, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think there are probably, out of that close to 2 million homeschoolers, there's some large number that is not at all interested in what we might call a public virtue or a public good or a common good. I did not talk to too many of those families, right? So one important thing to understand about the method of the research project that I conducted is we interviewed families who were willing to be interviewed, right? So if you can imagine, in social science research, you call this self-selection, right? So everyone who was in my sample chose to be in the sample, right? And understood why I was coming to talk to them and the kinds of interest that our project had, which was in, moral formation and civic formation. So it's likely that I'm speaking with families who are interested in those things already and willing to talk about them, right? So there's some number of homeschoolers who don't care at all about those things, and we don't know how large that group is. They're not in my sample. So I think it's an important sort of disclaimer to realize that when I report on how the families in our sample think about public virtue, it is a select group.
Sure.
Okay. So
yeah.
that's the disclaimer. Now, to the actual question, it really depends on, in terms of the definition that you read of public virtue, seeking the common welfare or the larger community beyond just the individual. It depends on how or at least for these homeschoolers, how that larger community is defined, right? So in some cases, the larger community might just be the family. And so some of these families said, look, what better group or community to learn us interests or the importance of interests other than your own, than your family, right? So how do you treat a sibling? So many of the parents I talked to about these questions thought about the family as sort of like the seedbed of a larger interest in public virtue, because you're fundamentally forced to think of those other than yourself, right? Sure. So in some cases, interest in public virtue, broadly understood, might start in the community of the family, right? In other cases, the homeschool groups operated in what we often refer to as co-ops. So these would be like larger groups of homeschool families who come together to either maybe do weekly activities, or in some cases, actual classes that they come together to conduct. So I broadly refer to those as co-ops. And so those are larger groups of homeschool families. And in some cases, homeschooling families' involvement in these co-ops was an example of understanding how a larger community and the interests of a larger community might help us learn why something other than our own interests are important, right? So what's the level of community? Is it the nation? Is it the public school? Is it the co-op? Is it the family? And so that's an important question. And so largely, most of these families did not understand public virtue in terms of what we might think of as the political.
Okay.
So in terms of government only. So in some cases, there was a lot of emphasis on citizenship training or civics classes, but not in very many.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so in some families or in some co-ops, there wasn't much attention at all given to what you and I might think of as civic education.
Mm-hmm.
And so their understanding of citizenship might be more in terms of volunteering at the soup kitchen, sure, or helping other homeschool families. And so one area when it comes to public virtue, I think for these homeschool families is, what is the public or what is the common?
Yeah.
And all of them, I think, agreed, whether they were sort of on the religious side or the non-religious side, agreed that the public school was not the only place or only community in which public virtue could be cultivated. Okay, so one of the really important things that came up for a lot of these families was what they called age segregation. Okay, so in school, your first grader is going to be in class with a bunch of other 6 or 7-year-old kids, and will not interact much with 10-year-old kids or 2-year-old kids or 18-year-old kids.
Yeah.
And so just the very nature of how school works, we segregate students by age. And for homeschoolers, this is problematic in as much as it doesn't help children understand perspectives of people of different ages. Okay, so one important component of public virtue, actually, that they would argue is understanding perspectives of people who are not your age. So in a school co-op, this example came up quite a bit. At the equivalent of a recess time, right, a playtime in one of these homeschool co-ops where you're actually meeting together for classes on a Wednesday or something. Yeah. Families would talk about the way in which their teenage children needed to figure out how to play a football game, let's say, that would include the young kids as well as the old kids, right? So in their minds, that's a skill that takes maybe a self-focused teenager out of his or her own sort of frame of mind and helps them understand what it's like to be a 6-year-old wanting to play with big kids and needing to accommodate that and needing to figure out how can we get along. So that might be a kind of public virtue that they would say they're trying to cultivate. Now, that age segregation also, I think many of the homeschool families that I interviewed at least were intergenerational homes. So they had grandparents living in the home with them and were actually very attentive to the way in which their children could interact with their grandparents on a regular basis. And so rather than being segregated by age in school, they were interacting with people of different ages, including the elderly. And so understanding how to talk to or engage with a person who is quite a bit older than you is also another sort of important skill. So those are not often things that we think of as public virtues, right? But homeschoolers sometimes did. And I think what they're trying to do, at least in the families that I interviewed, they're trying to think about the public in broader terms than simply interacting with the public school.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. So I guess along those lines, I think a lot of people, maybe who aren't homeschoolers, kind of have this stereotype that homeschoolers do just kind of withdraw from society, raise their kids in relative isolation. You've talked some about co-ops, and so that sounds like that sort of defies that stereotype. But is that generally what you found, that there was a lot of withdrawal? And if not, what other opportunities did homeschooling parents seek out to facilitate their kids' engagement with the world beyond their home?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is, and I'll start this answer with the same disclaimer I did with the last one, right? Because I think there are indeed a large number of homeschoolers who really are quite isolated, right? Yeah. And we sometimes read about these anecdotal stories in the news or something, or there's an interesting movie called Captain Fantastic, homeschool family that is quite withdrawn, right? And so I think those there are real cases of that. I think all researchers are eager to find out how many, right? What percentage of these 2 million homeschoolers might fit into that category?
Sure.
I didn't talk to them, right?
Yep.
Those are the kinds of families that probably would not welcome a researcher to come into their home, right? So I can't say much about that kind of isolation. It's there, and we just don't know how prevalent it is. The families that I interviewed are, on the more engaged side, right? And so their engagement takes a variety of different forms. So the most common form is what we call this co-op, right? And so that's a group of homeschooling families, and those groups might take different forms. So in some cases, on the religious side of homeschoolers, a co-op might form at a church, right? If there's a dozen or more families that all homeschool, that are all in the same church, they might gather at the church on a couple of weekdays. So those are pretty homogenous groups. In other cases, co-ops might form around a certain kind of pedagogical approach, right? So, there are co-ops that take a distinctly classical approach to education, right? So co-ops that offer courses where the great books are read and explored. And so in that case, it's a kind of pedagogical approach or educational philosophy that organizes the co-op. And in other cases, in smaller towns where you don't have large populations, you've got different kinds of homeschoolers who might be homeschooling for different reasons and come together just because they're the homeschoolers in this small community, and they might not have much in common other than the fact that they homeschool.
Sure.
And they come together. So the co-ops would be the main way. But because there's no sort of regimented school schedule, a lot of homeschoolers are highly engaged in various kinds of museums or cultural activities. And so more and more of these museums, I think, are capitalizing on the homeschool population. And so, I was on a field trip with one of my young kids this past year, and we visited Valley Forge National Historic Park, and the place was sort of overrun by homeschoolers that day because it was a homeschooling program that Valley Forge was putting on, and so there are, I think, places like that, museums, parks, other cultural sites that reach out to homeschooling communities, and that becomes a part of the engagement or educational process for homeschoolers. And so they're highly involved in those things. The other things I think that are probably worth mentioning here are the way in which employment actually becomes a part of a homeschooler's life. So a teenage homeschooler might have a job, and it's a job that doesn't just have to be in the evenings. So in this case, I interviewed the equivalent of a senior in school, an 18-year-old who was, and it was around the winter holidays. And so he was working at UPS, full-time job. And did that either on a night shift or a day shift, and would do his, coursework and education sort of on the margins of life. And so, and his mother was very, very adamant that his experience working at UPS was a highly educational experience and a part of sort of. So and he's engaged that way. The other thing I found interesting was the way in which technology becomes a significant component to a homeschooler's education, and a way in which it might prevent a kind of isolation that happens otherwise. So in a couple of really interesting cases, there were teenagers who sort of used social media as the point of connection with others. And so, they were engaging with people who they otherwise never would have known, because they had connected via social media. And in some cases, exploring really interesting things. So in one case, an issue of race and an issue of sexuality. So in one case, a student was in school and did not feel comfortable as a minority in that school, and felt like her status as a minority was challenging, and it was challenging for her to be in that school in that situation. So she started homeschooling, and as a homeschooler, she was able to connect around questions of racial identity through others via technology.
Okay.
And felt like she could pursue her identity as a minority via the access she had to others through social media. And in another case, a student was exploring and questioning her sexual identity, and felt like access to groups via social media and online offered her quite a bit more resources, more opportunity than she was experiencing in her public school. So I think the way in which media and technology creates avenues outside of the home was something else that homeschoolers were certainly harnessing to connect with others.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So I know you did talk about co-ops, people coming together. I was curious about whether in those co-ops you observed families who were different coming together, or were those mostly like-minded people? I mean, were the kids getting exposure to people who were thinking differently than them, or are they mostly similar ideologically?
Yeah. So, and this is, I think, highly relative and varied as well. So in many cases, you would get, especially on the religious side, you would get co-ops where you have high degree of like-minded people, and so the groups were quite homogenous, and that might be social class or racial or religious as well, right? So people who looked very similarly, who believed similar things, and that was part of the idea of why these groups emerged, right? So we can, and in terms of moral formation, a particular group of people shares certain kinds of values, shares certain kinds of commitments, wants to shape and form their children in a certain kind of way, and so these co-ops will form, and they will be quite homogenous.
Yeah.
That was very common. But in other cases, you would have some degree of heterogeneity in these groups. And so I would say that it sort of depends on how homeschoolers understand diversity and the ways in which they get exposed to it. So one common theme, in addition to the co-op, were what homeschooling families often call play groups. So, often starting with younger children, just sort of homeschooling families that might meet at a park to play together. And then in various regions or places where I did some interviews, these groups would actually be relatively diverse in terms of the type of homeschoolers. So in one of these groups, you might have religious homeschoolers and non-religious homeschoolers. You might have homeschoolers that come from wealthier families and homeschoolers that come from more disadvantaged families. And so it's the homeschooling is a common theme that could bring different groups together. So a couple of stories on this. In one of these groups, it was a co-op that was a little more diverse than than others. And so there were, quite secular people in this group. There were quite religious people in this group. There were some conservative Christians in the group, and also some Mormons in the group. This was sort of in the Southwest. And so this group tried to put on a play. They had a kind of a theater class, and they would try to put on a play on a regular basis. And one particular play that a homeschool mom told me about was a Shakespeare play, and there was a scene in the play where there was either kissing or sort of close. A female and male had to stand in close proximity to each other, and the female lead was from a very conservative Mormon home. Mm. And so both the students and the parents in this group had to kind of talk through how to handle that, right? And so some of the non-religious families in this group thought it was quite odd that the Mormon family might have some concerns about what happened in this play with their daughter. Mm-hmm. And they had to discuss those issues and work through them, right? And then figure out a way to actually make all groups at ease to accomplish the task of putting on a play. Yeah. And in this particular situation, one of the non-religious moms who was recounting the story thought that it was a really helpful example, especially in the kind of current political climate, of a situation where her kids had to actually engage with, and she did as a mom, had to actually engage with people who were quite different than they were. Mm. And to do it in a way that they could all accomplish a shared and common goal, putting on the play. Mm-hmm. And so, although, I think if you pressed her, she would have thought the concerns of the Mormon family were a little silly. I think she still was grateful for the opportunity to try to work through that and have her kids work through that, and felt like her kids learned quite a bit. And I think she feels like, or she felt like that that kind of engagement with people who were different than she was and than her kids were is pretty unusual. And she was quite grateful that her kids could have experienced that. And I'm not sure how normal kind of experience is, but I think in some cases there are co-ops or homeschool groups that do experience those kinds of differences. So there was another mom who, and again, this was a non-religious mom, but who was in a co-op with other families. Mm-hmm. And in this particular co-op, there was quite a bit of religious diversity. So there was a Muslim family and a Christian family and a Jewish family and her family that were non-religious. And she told a story about celebrating the Jewish Feast of Tents. And so they went over to the home of the Jewish family, and the Jewish family had a little sukkot, a tent in the backyard, and the Muslim family and the Christian family and the non-religious family got to sort of celebrate this festival with the Jewish family and learn all about that particular tradition. And she thought that was a pretty wonderful experience. And so I think there are maybe pockets or places in the homeschooling movement where you do see that kind of diversity celebrated and embraced. And it happens. I'm not sure that it happens all the time. I'm not sure how frequent that kind of interaction is. It is. I think it does happen in certain circles. And so I think for those that do experience that, that's one of the reasons why they homeschool, is because they feel like they can engage in that sort of diversity in ways that they might not be able to do if their kids were in the traditional school. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you. This has been really interesting and informative. And I just wondered, before we concluded, if there was anything else you felt that people might want to know about sort of the homeschooling sector, especially regarding moral formation, character formation, anything else that comes to mind to share? Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to think about homeschooling as an oppositional culture, which means that it often defines itself in opposition to something else. And so I think when it comes to all homeschoolers, whatever their motive is or whatever sort of moral framework that they operate from, they often define themselves by what they are not or by what they do not want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so those boundaries are pretty clear. And so it's, for religious homeschoolers, maybe the secular world is the world that they're trying to avoid. And so they're identifying who they are and how they want their children raised in opposition to a kind of secular world. For those non-religious homeschoolers, they might identify themselves in opposition to the structure and conformity of what they see in the public school. And so that opposition sort of defines the boundaries in which they're trying to raise their children. And so I think it's helpful to think about homeschooling as that kind of oppositional culture.
Yeah.
And therefore the kind of moral formation that happens is bounded and clarified by what homeschoolers are opposing. So and it takes different forms, right? So maybe I don't want my kid to become an expert test taker.
Yeah.
And that's what happens in schools, and I don't want that. It might be that I don't want my kid to be some kind of cog in a post-industrial economy, and that's how I understand public education, and so I'm avoiding that. It might be that I want my child to be a religious believer, and that would be threatened in some other. And so, the opposition, I think, really does define how these parents understand the kind of moral formation that they're happening.
Yeah.
Or that is happening in their homes. The other thing that I would say, I was last night I heard a educational reformer, civil rights activist from Milwaukee give a talk, and he said something interesting that I thought the homeschool families that I interviewed would have agreed with. He said that public education is an idea, and there are different delivery systems. At least he thinks there should be different delivery systems. And I think a lot of these homeschoolers would have said the same thing, that, they're not in the public schools. They're trying to educate their children, inform their children. And the delivery system is different. And they would certainly, embrace the idea of forming public citizens, but are just, I think about that quite differently than many of us do.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a good way to put it. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time today, and I'm sure this will be a helpful interview for our viewers.
Thank you, Joanna. Appreciate it.
All right, take care.